Good afternoon, everybody. This is your host, Chris Stanton, for the CSBS podcast. As you know, every week I do a live sportscast on Wednesdays at 3 o'clock, but I also do a weekly podcast to help you with some hints and tips of making your broadcast a more polished and better product. Today's podcast is about the art of interviewing. And it's not that complicated. There are some very easy steps which everybody can learn and live by as long as you remember them. But first, let's talk about interviewing on its most basic level. There are two basic types of interviewing. There's the news, and then there's the feature. News interviews are designed to gather information about an event, a person, or a current issue. And they tend to be shorter, than the features. For example, when you do a news interview, that's when you might be actually watching the news and a crime has happened in a neighborhood, so they are interviewing a person who lives in that neighborhood, and you might get a few snippets, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes several minutes, but usually never very long. And then there's the feature interview, and this is your 60 minutes type interview where you have an in-depth issue about a person or some sort of event, and you have an expert in that field. So when 60 Minutes has Ben Bernanke on to talk about the federal rates, that is a feature interview. There are two types or categories of interviews that you can do. There's the longer or the complete. That's where if you're listening to sports talk radio, you'll have the complete interview. Jay Cutler of the Chicago Bears will be joining us for the next half hour. Or you have segmented, where you take clips from an interview and you use that in your story. SportsCenter does that a lot, where they'll be covering a topic and then they'll take a few sound bites from an athlete in a locker room or in a post-game interview, and they'll use that in their segment. And in interviews, there are 5-step patterns that you need to follow. It's a 5-step pattern for an interview. The first is the opening. It's a short preview into your topic or theme of your interview. So, for example, I'm interviewing Joe Schmo, who is an expert in such and such. He's an expert in symbolism, what have you. Then there's the introduction, where you establish the credentials. So you have the opening, where you're going to be talking about the topic, and then the introduction of the person and what that person is towards the topic at hand. Then you have the question and discussion time period. Then you reintroduce, which it's called a reset, where you reintroduce who you're talking to and what you're talking about. And then you have the close, or your sign-off. So a good example of this would be in my upcoming interview next Wednesday. I'm interviewing a man named Josh Liss. And here's something that this would sound like for my opening. Hi, this is Chris Stanton for the CSBS, and today we're going to be talking about the Chicago Bears and sports in Chicago. Talking with us today is Josh Liss, the morning anchor and sports director for WBBM. And then you go on to ask some questions. After several questions, you bring your audience back in. For those of you who are just joining us, we have Josh Liss being interviewed today on the CSBS Sports Edition, and then you go right into another question. And then you close with a wrap-up. That's all the time we have for today. Please come next week and listen to us as we're going to such and such and so on and so on. These are your basic setup for your interview. Now, there are 7 deadly sins of interviewing, which you may have gathered from the title of this podcast. First of all, when we say 7 deadly sins, you realize these aren't always no-nos. These are just the general rules. These are things that you should always keep in mind when you're interviewing, but like any good rule, once you know it, then you know how to break it. It's just like writing. You're never supposed to start a sentence with but or and, but we have all read novels where the author does that. So interviewing is very much like that. You have these rules, and once you become accomplished, you can start tweaking them, bending them, breaking them. But these are 7 rules that you should always fall back on if you ever get stuck. And the first one is ask a question. It seems kind of an obvious one, but how many times have you heard a interviewer give a statement to his guest expecting his guest to then extrapolate based off the statement. You know, I live in the Chicagoland area. You hear this on sports radio all the time. So the Bears seem regrouped this year. That's a statement. That is not a question. Something along those lines. That's something you have to avoid. You want to use a question to direct your guest where you want to go with the interview, what you want them to say, how you want them to say it, and specifically what needs to be answered. The second part of that is you shouldn't piggyback questions. You know, those questions that have a two-part answer that are compounded. The problem with that is, one, it gets confusing to both the listener and the interviewee, and secondly, you don't even know how to answer it.
You should never be allowed to talk to people.
It's like, let's go back to the football example. Let's say we're interviewing Jay Cutler. Jay, do you think you can throw for over 4,000 yards this year, and is Brandon Marshall going to have over 20 touchdowns? Well, those are two separate questions. One is about his personal production on the field, and one is about his lead receiver's production. And the two aren't necessarily combined. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go about that question, and it's much more difficult for an interviewee to be answering two separate questions than one at a time. Plus, you lose your train of thought, you lose your rhythm of how he's going to be thinking this out, how he's going to be answering. So, one question at a time. Don't piggyback. And then don't overload a question. Don't make this long paragraph that ends with so what would you do? You can just go on and ramble. Here's a general rule of thumb. The question should never be longer than the answer. So don't set up this huge, long scenario and then ask how the person would deal in it. So going back to the football example. Jay Cutler, let's say it's 3rd and 7 and you're on the 25 and the defense is showing blitz and it's in the third quarter. You see where I'm going. Far too much setup. Few words as possible in your question. Jay, do you have a play for 3rd and 7 on late in the game? Boom, there's your question. Here's another one. Don't answer your own question. It seems, again, like a no-brainer, but how many times do you see people do this? Don't answer your own question. We're going to stick with this football example just for the sake of consistency. Like, Jay, you saw the safety move over during the blitz when you were being under rushed, didn't you? I mean, you threw the interception, but you must have seen him. See, you're asking him if he saw the safety come over during the blitz, but you've already answered that question, leaving him kind of confused on what to talk about. Another thing is you want to avoid hyperbole. And what does that mean? It means you don't want to set up your guests to fail. You don't want to make them sound so huge that they're only going to disappoint your audience. First of all, your guest isn't going to like that, being a disappointment to your audience, and your guest or your audience isn't going to like that, getting promised something and then you can't deliver. You can't say, Jay Cutler, future Super Bowl quarterback. He might not win the Super Bowl. That's not something you can do and that will sit well with your audience. And finally, this is the most important one. Don't put your guest on the spot for asking for the one. We as fans, we love questions like, who's your favorite? Who's the best? The problem with these questions is they are all opinion and there are no winners. And you're just going to have a backlash against your guest. So, Jay Cutler, who is the best player on the Bears team aside from yourself? Well, I'm telling you, nobody's going to like it being left off of that list if he starts listing who's the best on the team. So, there's your 7 deadly sins for interviewing. 1, always ask a question. 2, avoid closed questions. 3, no piggybacks. 4, don't overload the question. 5, don't answer your own question. 6, don't put your guest on a pedestal. And 7, don't ask for opinion questions about the one. And always remember, when in a jam, stick with the who, what, where, when, why, and how philosophy. If you need to improvise, if you've run out of questions, or the interview's taken a different turn than you thought, always go back to that. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. They are your base, and there's a reason why you get taught that at a young age, because it works. This is Chris Stanton. I've been for the CSBS podcast, and today we've been talking about the 7 deadly sins. I hope you enjoyed it. Please follow me on Twitter at the CSBS, follow me on Tumblr, and like my Facebook page. Coming at you live every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Listen for my live sports edition. This is Chris Stanton. Have a great weekend.